Thank you, everyone, for spending this lunch hour with us. I think I know most of you here, but there are a couple of unfamiliar faces. My name is Maria Tran. I was a product manager here at Guidewire for almost 9 years, and I left about 2.5 years ago.
And I'm Peter Rexer. I was the first consultant here at Guidewire, so spent a little bit of time out in the field. Good to see some really old faces that have been here for a long time, like Ben. Yeah, I left a few years ago, and we've been doing some interesting things.
And just to dispel any rumors that happens after you guys walk out, the reason why we did Grease together is because we are married, and it is official. And yes, we did meet at Guidewire and had a thing. But we're here today to talk about what we experienced while we were in Lesbos around the refugee crisis. It's also a presentation that is known as Why Peter and Maria is Not Skiing This Season. So according to UNHCR, worldwide there are about 60 million refugees. The war in Syria alone in the past 5 years has created 4.2 million people who are displaced outside of Syria, and untold millions who are actually inside Syria and displaced. And like most Americans, the way that the story has been played out in our media, sure, I saw the headlines, I saw the pictures, I even read newspaper articles about it. And yet somehow, because all of this was happening so far away, and all the numbers were so large, and all the images were so hard to deal with, that it was really easy for me to ignore it. And so, like for many people, this was a background story for me for most of the summer. And that remained the case until I saw the image of Ilan Kurdi's body washed up on a beach in Greece. I saw the story on my news feed on September 2nd. Ilan Kurdi was a 3-year-old Syrian boy. And that picture, for those of you who've seen it, is a universally horrifying picture for anybody to see. But for me, it was particularly so, and it was particularly painful because it reminded me of a period of my life that I hadn't thought about very much. It reminded me of me at 3 years old, because you see, I was also 3 when my parents were chased out of their homes in Vietnam because we were ethnically Chinese. And they were driven out of their homes and onto the Chinese border, where there were border police stopping us from coming back home because, for all intent and purposes, we were no longer Chinese. And according to the Vietnamese, we were not Vietnamese enough to live there. So stuck without any real opportunities and any real choices, my parents made the very difficult choice of selling everything that they had, and along with a bunch of friends, paid passage on a little wooden fishing boat. And they took off from the coast of Vietnam. And we were lucky enough to have been rescued by the Coast Guards in Coast Guards in Hong Kong several days later. And these are actually pictures of myself when I was at the refugee camp, when I was 3. You can see on the picture up towards that corner there, me and a friend, and we're basically sitting on top of a bed, a little wooden bed that is a bunk bed where there are multiple layers of bunk beds. And this particular bunk bed was home to my family, the 3 of us, my mom, my dad, and myself, for about 6 months. There was no mattress. Our cooking utensils were there. All our clothes and all our belongings were there. You can see that we're hanging towels up there. This was our home. And when I think back to that time and I think about my life and how I'm here, all of that only happened because I was rescued, whereas Ilan Kurdi was not so lucky, and he ended up dead on a beach. And so it made me really wonder then, because the refugee crisis had been developing for so many years, and also the refugee crisis in Europe had been developing for a whole year, and we've been seeing those headlines, why it took that particular picture to wake me up, to remind me about this, and to make me want to take action. And it really was because that picture, unlike all the other media images that we've seen up until that point, that picture humanized the situation. It brought it down to a level that we can understand, that we can place ourselves in that shoe. And it made me realize that in order for people to understand the plight that people are going through, and in order to empathize with what's happening, we really need to understand this whole big crisis at a personal level. So one of the first things that it made me do was it made me come out very publicly and share my story. In fact, it's one of those things that I never thought I would do because it's such a long time ago and it's such a background story. And I feel like up until a few months ago, it really didn't have a large part of my life. But I did it. At first, I shared the story on Facebook with just my friends. And then based on all the feedback that I had gotten, and feedback from many of you guys, you know, people that I've known for years who had no idea that somebody from Silicon Valley, somebody successful, somebody that they work with, somebody that they live next to, somebody they call friends, you know, somebody that they think is just like themselves, could have gotten their start rescued off of a boat and could have had the label as refugee. So I was encouraged to share that publicly, and I realized at that point when I had over 200 shares of my original post that what an important thing it was for me to do. And it made me realize that not only do I have to tell my own story and encourage other people to do so who are former refugees, it made me want to go and figure out what are the current stories that are developing right now. Who are the current refugees? How do I help them tell their stories because they can't do that? So I started to talk about this idea and this passion. Peter and I were in a car, and we were figuring out, driving up to Tahoe and trying to figure out what we can do about this. And I think we basically came up with the idea that, like, I needed to go, and I needed to go and learn about this and meet people and start talking about the story. But I really had no plan because, like, I don't speak Arabic. B, I'm not a photographer. C, I'm not even a writer or a journalist. But I felt really passionate about it. And came Monday morning when I went back to the office, I told people about this plan, that I wanted to go off to Europe and do this. And of course, given that it's Facebook, somebody knew somebody, and they hooked me up with this guy named Majd, who had just that very morning hosted a Kickstarter project. And Majd was a former Facebook employee. He's now the founder of Darkroom, for those of you who like doing photo editing on iPhones. Majd is a Syrian American. He came over when he was 15. And just like myself, when he saw all this was happening and he saw the media images of who Syrians are, he really wanted to dispel that. He really wanted to have the opportunity to tell the story of who Syrians are, why are they fleeing the war. So Majd, along with a photographer friend of his, were going to go on this trip. And so I met up with Majd in a very, San Francisco hipster kind of a way. We met up in Valencia at Ritual Coffee. Yes, a lot of nods from the San Francisco folks. And after an hour of talking to this guy, we really bonded. And I walked out of there saying, hey, Majd, I think I'm going to come along with you. And he's like, we're winging it anyway, so come on along. Which was awesome, right? And so I came home, and I was like, hey, hon, I think I'm going to go off to Europe with this guy I just met and had coffee with. And I did, and it was great. And Peter was like, okay, sounds like a great idea. And I did, and it was amazing because that particular trip changed my life. And the rest of this presentation, I'll go into talking about that particular trip and the different places that we went. I only followed them for 2 weeks. They actually spent 2.5 months on their project on the first trip. But now I'd like to take it up a little and talk to give you a sense of the overall magnitude of what we're talking about, because as I go through the individual stories, all of these numbers and charts and graphs will become super important to just help you put context to it. So this data was updated as of December 30th. And the number that's shown here is actually even updated since then. Basically, in 2015, there has been about 1 million people who've made the crossing and landed from Turkey to Greece and sought refuge. And if you look at these numbers, there are a few things that I want to point out because there's a lot of misunderstanding about what's actually happening, right? Because when you hear about this, people think of it as the Syrian refugee crisis because there's an active war in Syria. But in fact, when you look at the numbers, only about 60% of the people who are coming over are Syrians. And this was something that I myself was surprised by when I was actually there. There are tons of people who are coming from Afghanistan, from Iraq, from North Africa, and people come for all kinds of reasons. You know, there are people who are escaping from violence and war, as in the case of the Syrians, in certain places in Iraq, as well as in Afghanistan. But there are also people who are running away from religious persecution as well. There are Christians in these places, and they're being harassed. Or there are other sects, right, of Islam in these places, and they're being harassed. There are people who are gay in these places, and they're being harassed. So there are lots of reasons why people come, but I wanted you to know that in the larger scale, Syrians is the predominant group, but there's also Afghans, there's also Iraqis and Iranians and North Africans. The other thing to note here, too, is a couple of major points so you can see how things develop. You can see that the chart has been very low, like in the beginning of the year, and just really shot up towards the summer. And then definitely in October when I was there were some of the highest volume days. I marked 2 points on this, and these are 2 kind of big global points that makes it interesting to keep in mind. The first point is when right after the Ilan Kurdi incident, Angela Merkel got on national TV and basically said, Germany would welcome any refugee that seeks refuge in Germany. And a lot of people blame her proclamation for the rise in refugees. But I want to also make note that that probably does contribute to it, but it's not the whole story because you can see that the numbers were already on the rise even before then. And I'll talk a little bit about why that is, too. And then the second piece was this happened in November 29th, the day that we had arrived on Lesbos the second time. And that was when the EU signed an accord with Turkey, $3 billion to pay Turkey to keep refugees from leaving Turkey. So these are the destination countries where people end up, and you can see that Germany is taking a large number. There's a huge number who are trapped in Hungary still, but most people are trying to get up to the northern European countries where the asylum procedures as well as benefits are a little bit better. But I want to bring out something that's also really important to note that kind of gives a good backdrop on this, because we in the West only heard about this problem this year, right, and really at the late summer, early fall. And there's 1 million people who have arrived in Europe, and that's a lot of people. But this thing has been happening for really many years, right, pretty much since the Syrian war started. And if you look at the numbers of Syrians and where they are at, that refugee crisis didn't happen in 2015. In fact, it happened when the Syrian war broke and things got really bad because there are over 2 million refugees in Turkey. Lebanon has over 1 million refugees. And basically right now, if you look at what a small country it is, 1 in 4 people in Lebanon is a refugee. Think about what a load that is on that country, right? Jordan, similar kind of issue if you look at just, based on population numbers. And so I showed you this chart because I want you to understand that this whole refugee crisis and the way that we're dealing with it is really a refugee crisis for the West, right? Whereas, meanwhile, in the Middle East, it's been a refugee crisis for a very long time. And when you see the numbers of the people in these places, it actually helps answer part of the reason why we're seeing so many people make it out to the West now. Because when people are in these countries, while they're able to stay, they're in really bad, decrepit camps. They've been in those camps for a number of years. They can't work. Their kids can't go to school. And so when you're trapped in these places for several years at a time and you lose hope and you can't work, your kids can't go to school, it drives you to do very desperate things like put your little babies on a boat and try to make the run over to Greece. And the other thing that's contributed to this is that Turkey, frankly, the smugglers in Turkey just figured out a whole industry of how they can automate putting 50 people on a boat, thousands of people at a time, and pushing them off and onto the shores of Greece. And that really has a lot to do with it, the whole infrastructure and industry around the smuggling piece. So that's a bit of the backdrop. I'll talk a little bit more now about the countries that I saw. And with that backdrop, I think it'll be useful for you to understand, now I'm going to go into the actual individuals that I met and the places that I saw and my own personal experiences of what those places were like. So we met Majd in Norway, in Oslo, and the reason why we did that was just simply because of two reasons. One, Norway was one of those places that refugees ended up, and two, it was super cheap to fly from San Francisco to Norway. Okay, sure. So in Norway, at the time that I was there in late October, the main registration for refugees when they come is at the main central police station. And so what happens is that when people cross the border and make their way, they get funneled through to Oslo and into this refugee center. They come in, they register. At the time that they register, the police take their belongings and they take their phones. And presumably they're taking those for searching to make sure that, security and everything checks out. But that's actually a really scary thing because, for many of these people, their phone is their lifeline. Their phone is what they're able to connect to their families to tell them that they're safe. So a lot of people get very nervous, especially if they don't understand the language and why people are taking it. And so when I was there, I was so heartened to learn that there is a bunch of well-meaning volunteers who go out there and who make it their job to explain to people that this is what's going to happen so that they feel more comfortable and that they're actually prepared for what's actually going to happen. The Norwegian government has been one of those governments who's done a lot for refugees. When I was there, they were converting hotels and basically blowing up blocks of hotel rooms and converting any open space into places where they can shelter and house refugees. So this is a picture of the underground parking lot next to the police station of the Best Western that's there. And so, you can actually see if you look closely that those are the parking lines. And they created this space as kind of a community center. They added heat, they added electricity, just so that people, after they register while they're waiting and staying in the hotels, so that they have a place to gather. There are TVs, shows that are on. There's a back wall with art of all the flags where the refugees were coming from. They even had people who come out who were volunteer nurses and, barbers to come and give people haircuts. Like, I was really, really happy for what I saw of the Norwegian response to that. And we were able to hang out there for a while talking to the volunteers. And then we were able to meet a bunch of really cool guys. These are 4 guys that I've met who had just arrived the night before, and they were Syrians. I met Monir, who's the guy in the little hoodie whom I still keep in touch with right now, and his friends Mahmoud, Wisdom, and Mohammed. And in talking to these guys, I wanted to ask them the big question that most people had, which is, why are there so many young single men traveling? And I want to ask that question because that's the perception that we got, right? But one of the numbers I didn't point out in the UNHCR chart is that of the 2015 numbers of refugees that came over, 45% of those are women and children, 45%. And if you take into account the men who are the brothers, the fathers or the husbands of these women, the number of single young men traveling is actually a lot lower than what the media would have you believe. That was my big takeaway there. But there are single young men, and so, at that point I didn't have those numbers, and I asked these guys. And every single person that I met cited 2 things. The number one thing that they cited was mandatory military service. If you're in Syria and you're not the only son, then you automatically get drafted into war by the government. And there are many places that are actually not controlled by the government, but controlled by ISIS or one of the opposition forces. And they will come through neighborhoods, and they will do sweeps, and they will grab the men, and you will have to fight. And guess what? You fight for one group one week, next week some other group takes over, then you're in trouble because you're now labeled a fighter to the opposition force. And that was the primary reason that every single one of the Syrian young men that I've met cited for why they left. Munir was not the only son. And so, according to Syrian laws, he would have had to join. The other reason why they've all cited that they had to leave was that every single one of them have lost somebody that they loved, a friend, a neighbor, a family member, and that just became too much. And they all had to come, and they all had to find a way for themselves. And many are alone, and we've met lots of other men who are traveling alone who were fathers, but they want to come somewhere safe before they send for their family. And that's another reason why we hear that. So after Oslo, we went down to Turkey, and specifically to Izmir, Turkey, and very specifically to a neighborhood called the Basmani. Izmir is the third largest city in Turkey. We went there because it is the epicenter for where people organize trips for going to Greece. And specifically in this Basmani neighborhood that's like pretty tiny, all of this activity happened, especially back in October before the EU Accord. I'll talk a little bit about what happened after that too. And, you know, we stayed in a really nice hotel. It's like a W-looking hotel. It was super fancy, super nice, 45 euros a night. It was pretty darn awesome. But right around the corner, you can see signs of human smuggling all over the place. It was happening at this point just out in the open. Nobody tried to hide anything. This is right around the corner from our hotel. These tea houses, that's where people were sitting and negotiating deals and stuff like that. Because Medj speaks Arabic, you know, we were doing a couple of walkthroughs just to scope out the place, and he's like, yeah, they're talking about doing these, they're negotiating prices and things like that. You know, you walk around the corner and you see these boys who are just out there selling life jackets, and chances are they're not even real life jackets. If anybody's seen the news yesterday, the Turkish police just, you know, broke into a big ring where they were making fake life jackets for people, life jackets filled with things that are not even floating. So it's all out there. Now, since the November 29th agreement, everything has been shut down and calmed down a bunch. Everything is still happening because we have friends who are over there, but it's not happening overtly on the streets anymore. It's happening in the background. It's happening in hotel rooms. It's happening where people are hiding it more. While we were there, we were able to meet up with a few people, and I thought that this was super interesting because it gave us a perspective into, you know, what life is like in Turkey and why are people making the trip. This guy here is named Ziad. Ziad is awesome. I call Ziad the selfie dude because you go and look at Ziad. At first, I didn't know if I should take him seriously because somebody introduced me to him, and I checked up his Facebook profile, and it was like all of these selfies with him and everyone else, and they were all like in Arabic, so I had no idea. I'm like, is this guy for real? And then I realized that what Ziad is doing, Ziad speaks 4 different languages. Ziad is from Syria. Ziad, before the war, was a lawyer, and he was educated in Oxford. Ziad had been in Turkey for 3 years. And I asked him, Ziad, why didn't you leave? And he said, I love my mother too much. Later on, we went to his house, and we met his mother and his dad, and they were very, very old, and they were in no condition to travel, and I knew exactly what he meant. Like, he could not go and leave them alone. He was the only person who was taking care of them. And even with Ziad's credentials, right, of speaking fluently all those different languages, Ziad had trouble finding work in Turkey because, again, even though they had 2 million Syrian refugees in Turkey, Syrians are not allowed to work. Syrian children aren't allowed to go to school. Now, Ziad is very resourceful because he speaks all these different languages, and he's a really smart guy. And so after 2.5 years, he found a job, and his job is with an American company. who needed someone who speaks Turkish and Arabic and English. And so he lucked out. And the only reason why he was able to work and work legally is because he knows the law and he found a way, and he went to Istanbul. And, you know, I don't know what else he did, but he was able to get a work permit, and that's not something that everyone's able to do. And when Ziad's not working, he is a humanitarian. He goes out and he tries to find and sync up with other people from Syria, and he tries to help them. And that's actually how we hooked up with him, and that's actually why he has so many selfies, because that's his way of actually, when he meets people, he connects with them, he friends them on Facebook, he takes selfies with them, and that's his way of actually connecting with them as they travel or as they stay and whatnot. And so this is a picture of us on top of Izmir with a selfie with Ziad. And this is, you know, also a great example. This woman back here, her name is Rula, and Ziad had just found her 2 days ago at an artist exhibit that was trying to raise awareness for the Syrian plight. And Rula has the most amazing story, one of the most amazing stories that I've come encounter with. She is one of the most beautiful, strongest 25-year-olds I've ever met. And talking to her was amazing because we now have a female perspective on what it's like. Rula at the time was only in Turkey with her mom and her sister. 5 days before we met her, they had sold a lot of the possessions that they had and paid for passage for her brother to go over to Greece. And she knew 5 days ago that he made it over to Greece, but she was worried sick that she hadn't heard from him since. And the plan was for him to make it to Germany and then send for them, which is super common. So I asked Rula, what was it like, you know, to be now left with 3 women in Turkey? And she looked at me and she cries, and she starts telling me all these different stories that are really too difficult to repeat. And we spent all day with Rula, and there were a few things that happened even while we were with her that punctuated what her experiences might have been like from a day-to-day perspective of what being a refugee in Turkey might mean. We went into a cafe, me, Medj, Sarah, and Rula. And we sat down. The waitress came over, took our orders. When it came time for Rula to order, she ordered pomegranate juice. And pomegranate juice is very common in Turkey. And we knew the word for it because we had all ordered it. And the waitress pretended not to understand. She then ordered Coca-Cola. And Coca-Cola spends tons of money on branding. In every single country, it's Coke or Coca-Cola. Everyone knows it. And yet the waitress, again, pretended not to understand. When she came back, she bought 3 drinks, and she walked away. She served Medj, Sarah, and myself, and she did not serve Rula, and she was completely fine with it. Later on that day, we were walking across the street, and there was it's a tiny little street. Traffic is slow. There's this little motorbike and a guy in it, and there were, at that point, like 5 or 6 of us walking across the street. The motorbike, intentionally, the guy comes right up to Rula and bumps into her, just shoves right into her. And it was just dumbfounding for me because, you know, in this country, we're not used to seeing things like that. We're not used to people being treated like that. We read in the history books that people were treated like that, but it's really awful when you're with somebody and you just think, wow, this is when we are with her. What is the situation like for her, her mother, and her sisters when we're not there? And so when people wonder why people are making the move and going to Europe, I think they need to start thinking about what the situation is like for them in these Middle Eastern countries and why, in that kind of desperation, they feel the need to make a move and make a change. So after Izmir, we went to Greece, and I did a bunch of research online and found that, like, Lesbos is the #1 place where people leave. And, you know, I have to admit that before coming to this whole area, I really was not familiar with it at all. But there are a set of tiny islands right here that are only anywhere between 3 miles to 7 miles off of the Turkish border. And those islands have been disputed over the years, but they are Greek islands. And when you hear in the news how people come, that's how they come. So while Athens is all the way here, people are just hopping over the islands across the channel there. So here's what ended up happening, right? So this is a close-up. And you see that this is the north coast of Lesbos. And most of the boats come in through this little 5-mile stretch between Malavos and Skala Sikamenia. And you can see how close this is when people leave these places. At the shortest route, it's only 3.5 miles. We use binoculars, and we're able to actually see people on the beaches in Greece before they leave. It is that close. And so because we were Americans and traveling with American passports, we were able to buy a ferry ride over. And at the morning that we were leaving, there were 3 large ferries that were leaving, and it cost me 15 euros to pay for that trip. And I took a picture of how empty our ferry was. There was only, I think, about 11 people on our ferry. And yet, you know, if I weren't American, I would be paying 1,300 euros at that time for the privilege of risking my life and handing my life over to a bunch of smugglers and get into a dinghy with 50 other people on a boat that barely floated. And so this is a picture of Skala, and the rest of the story really revolves around, you know, what happens in Skala, what happens in Lesbos as people arrive. Skala is a little town of 150 people. And so we went in, checked into the hotel, not knowing what we were going to be expecting. Like, we know that boats were coming in and stuff, but nothing we read, no images that we could have seen at that particular time could have prepared us for what I saw when I got there. I walked down to the little stretch of harbor. It's only like a 3-minute walk from the little hotel. Like, everything is really small. And, you know, I was just poking my head around, just trying to get a feel for the place. And this guy, this like really friendly Malaysian dude, yells out, "Hey, where are you from?" And at first I got scared because some of the other NGOs haven't been really nice to people just coming and checking things out. But like, this guy comes and then he hugs me. He's like, "Oh my God, you're the only other Asian person I've seen on the island." And then I knew he was a friend. And his name is Ryan, and he's really sweet. He's 25 years old, and he's made it his business to take over the tea and the soup tent at this landing site. And within 10 minutes of talking to Ryan, and I'm so glad I took this picture because, you know, we were just talking, and somebody yelled out, "Boats!" And we both turned around, and I caught his vest, and I just thought, and I saw the boats in the background, and I thought, wow, that's amazing. I needed to snap that shot. And you can see that, like, very clearly 2 boats out in the horizon, but there were actually 4 boats out there. And this is a photo that I took of the first boat coming in. And this is what made it so real for me. There's a baby that they just grabbed out of the boat from that picture as I was running down to the beach, and I saw this happen. And throughout that night, there were hundreds of people who came in, boat after boat after boat. And when you get to see these people and look at their faces and help their children, you get a totally different perspective that any big newspaper article could really write about it. And so this will give you a sense for how things work. People land in boats, and they walk up to the camp. This is like on a nice, happy, sunny day. There are families that are walking, and there's a bunch of volunteers who rent cars, and all they do is they drive families up to the transit camp because the transit camp is up on a hill another mile away. So all these Good Samaritans are there so they can drive little families up so that they don't have to walk. That little baby in the mylar that you saw in that first picture, it's actually this little guy here. And I spent, you know, my first half an hour there basically changing the set of kids and getting them food and talking to the family, talking, you know, in gestures and stuff because they didn't speak English, and just holding these kids and making them feel safe. And it really was incredible. After that, you know, before we sent them off, I asked the mom if I could take a picture of her. She was just so beautiful. I look at this photo, and it gets me every single time. Look at her strength and her beauty and her dignity as she looks out into the camera. You know, they had just made the trip of their lives, risking the lives of their 3 children. And I look at that picture and it just gets me all the time because she is just so incredibly dignified in that picture. Bad things happened while I was there. You know, the first night was a really, you know, for all intent and purposes, a nice, comfortable night, even though people were coming in all throughout the night. There was no rain. It was, you know, fairly comfortable. But the weather changed, and for 3 of the 5 days while I was there, it was raining and was cold. You know how the weather that we just got the last few days? Picture that, but windier and about 10 degrees colder. That's what it was like on Lesbos when I was there. And the transit camp up the road, what was supposed to happen is that people go there and that buses, UNHCR buses, was going to pick them up and take them to the registration camp. But that didn't happen. Most of the time when I was there were no buses and no volunteers at the transit camp. The first night when it was super rainy, and this was the excuse that we got. It was like, oh, it's so raining, the seas were so choppy, nobody was coming, so we didn't send anyone. Well, this is what it looked like that night up in that transit camp. 2,000 people showed up at the shores that night. That night, the transit camp is made to house maybe 500 people to just sit there while they wait for buses. So we had 2,000 people, and this is what it looked like. There were families crammed together, sleeping all on top of each other. And this is the people who made it inside the tent. Outside the tent, people were just standing, barely standing room only, out in the cold. I had a really difficult time that night because people were starting to walk back. People we were sending up into the transit camp were walking back. And because everything is so small in the hotel room that I had, there's no insulation. The windows barely worked. I had a really hard time that night because I heard people right outside in the street, and they were sleeping and being there all night. After the transit camp, they go to a place called Moria, and this is where they register. These are pictures taken from my friend Linda, who stayed at the same hotel as me. And she went out to Moria, and she checked out the situation. All the people who are arriving in those rainy days end up here, and they all have to register. And at that time, the registration line was 4 days long, and it was cold and in the rain. And at that point in October, there were no services set up. And so the feeding and caring for these refugees were placed basically on volunteers like myself, other people who just basically made it their business to go and buy food, and this is what happened a lot. We would go and buy food and drive up to these places and hand out things as much as we can, and that was about it, which is a really horrible situation to be in. The large NGOs like UNHCR and other folks, they weren't there on the other side of the gate. They were not helping the people out there. It was just grassroots efforts and everyday volunteers. This is a photo of the Karatepe camp. This is the camp for Syrians. Because Syria is in an active war, they get preferential treatment, and this is where they are at. And preferential treatment means that they have some kind of shelter, and these are like plastic little shelters. And I can tell you, having visited there, that the conditions aren't that much better. We had one guy, well, Medj, Sarah, and I were there, one guy who recognized Medj from us helping them off the coast, and he knew Medj spoke Arabic, and he started like grabbing on Medj very desperately. And what we learned from having spoken to him was that he had 14 children with him and 3 families in one of these little huts. And they were on a downhill side, and water had washed in because it had rained all day, and all the blankets were wet, and all their kids were wet. And he wanted Medj to help them get blankets. And we were just showing, we had no idea where to get blankets or anything else. We just showed up. But we got involved in this drama, and that's one thing that we find ourselves doing, is that you just get involved because there is nobody else to do this. And so we spent the time, and we helped them find, blankets. We found volunteers eventually who were behind other gates, and we were able to talk our way into it because, we're Western, and we talk our way into all kinds of things. And then they held Medj. UNHCR held Medj there because he speaks Arabic. And this is the one thing that I'm just so shocked by, is that UNHCR is chartered to take care of these refugees. In this camp that they're serving thousands of people, they had nobody who spoke Arabic. And here they are grabbing at my friend Medj to stay to help because he speaks Arabic. And that was just a situation that we saw over and over again that just completely dumbfounds me about how we answer to this type of crisis. I was ill-prepared at that time, and all I had were candies on me. And I gave these little kids candies, and you can see just like how happy they were. They were chasing me down, and it was just really sweet. So I needed to include a picture of them here. The other thing I wanted to show you is to talk about what the experience like after they stay a couple of days and get registered. They all get to the port. After they get registered, they actually get official papers that will let them travel through the EU so that they can eventually hopefully make it to whatever destination countries that they're at. Every single night you see this picture repeated. There are thousands of people waiting at the ferry station for the next ferry to come. And there are police in riot gear here, and I was really discreet. That's why the picture is really fuzzy, but I wanted to take the picture anyway to let people know just how insane the situation is as people are trying to make their way over. So this is how they took a ferry, and it's about a 12-hour ferry between Lesbos all the way to Athens. And I want to talk a little bit about what happens in Athens and then what happens the rest of the way. Since Hungary has closed their border, the only border where people can pass now is through Macedonia. Macedonia is not an EU country. And so Macedonia, like many places, if you hear them building out fences and walls and stuff, all these countries are actually doing a lot to erect fences on their borders. And the new thing that Macedonia did a couple of weeks before we got there, the second time we visited, was they closed the borders to anybody who's not SIA. And when I say SIA, it means Syrians, Iraqis, or Afghans. And so what you end up with is a lot of people who come from all these other places. Remember that chart? All these other places. And now they're stuck. There were thousands of people stuck in this place called Edamini on the Greek side of the Macedonia border. And I show this picture here because this, again, personalized the story for me. The boy back here, his name is Mohammed. We took this picture at the Moria Tea Camp where Peter and I volunteered at for a few days. While we were there, Mohammed was there every single day. And we learned, and he helped us pass out oranges, he helped us translate, he helped us serve tea and soup, and started talking to other volunteers and started talking to him, and we learned his story. Mohammed's 22. He's Afghan ethnically, but he's lived in Pakistan with his uncle since he was 4 because his family was so poor. And his uncle kicked him out recently, and he had no other place to go, and he thought, why not go to Europe? Everyone else is going to Europe, and he has an uncle in Germany. So he got it in his head that it was a good idea to do that. And so poor Mohammed, who doesn't speak English, doesn't have a lot of information, came along this journey and hitchhiked, bus, got car rides all the way to Lesbos, and now he's trapped because the Macedonia border is closed. So we're friends with Mohammed on Facebook, and this is the latest picture that I got from him. This was him trying to make a run for the Bulgarian border with a bunch of smugglers. He sent this 2 days ago. I checked in on him today, and he's back in Athens because there were police. And here's the racket that we hear that's happening in the Bulgarian border. Basically, the smugglers and the police work together. They will actually tip the police off on when they're coming, and the police would jail people and then make people pay. And then guess what? The smugglers get another opportunity to swindle people again. So poor Mohammed now, after having tried that, is now back in Athens again, and he's been in Athens for 2 weeks now. And there are thousands of people like him in Athens right now, thousands. So more on the people we met. So this is great. Peter and I took a ferry over to Chios, the other island that was south, to check it out because we were hearing more boats were coming in there after the November 29th accord. I took a picture of this baby because he just stopped me on my tracks. This little baby is a preemie. He looks so fragile. I've never seen a more fragile-looking baby. And I asked the parents about him. And it turns out that he basically was born a preemie. They don't know how much, preemie. But this baby was already a month old by the time that I saw him. And I just can't imagine what it was like for them to get on that boat with that little baby and 50 other people and made it that far. They were Syrians and fleeing the war from Syria. Other people that I've met, this woman, again, stopped me on my tracks. We brought their boat in one morning at the Scala site. And while I was running around getting clothes for babies, I just, saw this ginormous belly in the corner of my eye, and I had to stop, and I had to take a picture because that woman was ready to give birth. And I took her picture. I also took pictures of the shoes because we bought shoes the night before, and both her mother and her mother-in-law wore shoes that we bought, which was really awesome. 3 days later, we bumped into them. Peter and I were in Athens because we wanted to check out the situation there, and we figured out that, in our really scrubby way, one of the good ways that we can help refugees was, to buy groceries from a nearby store, push it in a shopping cart, and go out to this park and just started feeding people because the camps wouldn't let us in to help. And one of the guys that Peter had talked to at the camp came up and said, "Hey, it's me." And then I recognized him and the boat that he was in, and so I started showing pictures. I'm like, do you know where these people are? And then he's like, yeah. And he grabbed me, and we walked over, and we saw Amiri again and Zahara, and we learned who they are, and we learned their stories. And because now we have Sahi to translate for us, we can learn more about their stories. This woman, Zahara, is the mother-in-law to Amiri. Amiri is 19, and she's pregnant, 9 months pregnant. And they left because Zahara's husband got killed by the Taliban. And they left right after that. Didn't matter how pregnant she was, they left. Here is Zahara holding me, and that's how she was that whole time that we were together. She wouldn't let me go because this is the second time I'd seen her, and she wanted me to get on the bus with them to head to Macedonia, and she wanted me to go to Germany with them. And I was tempted, but I couldn't. But you can imagine, just what that must be like for them, having gone through what they went through. I mean, she cried telling me the story about her husband, and I cried with her. And, we really bond. We get really close to these people. And here's another sweetheart. Those of you who've read my post, this is Zaina, and she's this incredible little girl who just stole my heart. She came in the last morning that we were there, and she was just full of spirit and happiness, running around, totally happy. I tried to take off the little floaty toy that they put on her, and she wanted to keep that on because it was like fun and games for her. After we got them warm and stuff, I thought out little hand puppets. She chased me all around camp, kissing me with a hand puppet. This is her mom and her 4-month-old brother that I also changed. I gave them apples. I took care of them. I just hung out with them. Couldn't speak much to them, didn't understand language, but we understood, enough about compassion. And when I left, both Zaina and her mother just helped me and gave me kisses before they left. This is Teheray. Teheray is another person from Afghanistan. She is incredible. She is beautiful. For one thing, she's just breathtaking. Another thing is that she spoke English really, really well. And so she and I started talking, where did you learn your English? At school? Where did you go? YouTube. She tells me YouTube. I learned English on YouTube. And then I was like, that is awesome. And so she asked me where I was from. I said, told her California. She's like, I love California. California is awesome. And then I told her where I work. And she's like, I love Mark Zuckerberg. And this girl is so amazing. And now she's in Germany. And I got an email from her a few days ago saying that they're in a house. They have a room. They have hot running water and 2 meals. And then she said, I want to stay in Germany. There is no rape. There is no killing. And then she tells me she wants to learn German, but the translator said, you don't need German. I'm here. And then she says, And she's now learning German through the radio and through the newspaper. That's just the kind of gal Teheray is, and she's just all kinds of awesome. Another family that we met, Peter really bonded with this guy, Mohammed, and we saw them again, one of those places, one of those things that we see these people multiple times. We saw them on the coast when we helped them in and spent a whole morning with them, and then later on, we found them again at Moria, and they did not, I mean, again, they have no idea what they were expecting, don't know language. They didn't know where they were going to sleep. And Peter and I found them a little hut for them to sleep that night. And now he's in Austria, and he's friends with us on Facebook and sends us photos of his babies all the time. Yep, another one of the sweethearts. Nargis, I call her Elsa because she introduced herself to me as Elsa because she loves Frozen. So she's like this Afghan girl, 10-year-old Afghan girl, comes and introduces herself as Elsa, right? It's like it just tells you how small the world is. And, you know, we were buying toys that day, and I asked her if she and her sisters will hang out and help me pass out toys. And when I was at the toy store, I saw this Elsa purse, and I had to buy it for her. And, oh, my gosh, she loved me so much for that. She wouldn't let go of me when I gave it to her. She was just awesome. You know, and I call them the selfie sisters because they were so beautiful, and they just loved taking selfies with me. And now they're in Germany, and they're safe, and it makes me feel so happy that I'm actually in contact with these guys. I'm going to go through these fairly quick, but I do want to highlight a couple of people here, and they're mostly the Greek people because these are the guys who are actually like, you know, just through no other reason but geography, they're kind of stuck dealing with this problem, right? These are Greek people. Greece is in full economic crisis right now. And there are these wonderful people that we met who just made it their lives to help. This guy here, his name is Apostoli. And he's kind of like this really grouchy guy, you know, when we're busy and stuff. He'll yell at people and go, milk for baby, milk for baby. And he's basically telling all his volunteers to don't give milk to anybody else except for babies because milk is really expensive. But Apostoli has like the kindest heart of anybody that I met. He was the guy that I learned how to deal and how to treat children who are coming in shock. Because all resources are scarce, Apostoli had this like stash of stuffed animals that he takes out only for the worst, you know, kids. And I didn't know this. Like I was there for 3 days before there was this brother and sister coming up, and I was trying to give them candy, trying to get them to eat because I know that they weren't going to get food for a few days if we didn't feed them. And like with his grandfatherly instinct, Apostoli just knew. He grabbed the toys and he gave it to him. He started playing with them. And like next thing you know, within 3 minutes, we got these kids to eat. You know, he was just that kind of a guy. And so he's just incredible. There's so many more stories about like how even before the crisis happened, before any volunteers showed up, he and this guy in this beat-up van just started driving along the coast because more and more people were coming in. And at that point, they had nothing, you know, but some pairs of shoes and stuff that people, their family and friends donated, and he'd give those out. And, you know, he'd tell those stories really, you know, just fondly with tears in his eyes, just talking about how they did that. Jason is another guy. He's like the civil engineer who's unemployed right now. And, you know, he was there in October, and I met him, and he came back with his boat after seeing what happened. And now he's made himself, you know, a captain of the boat, and they go and they rescue people, and they make sure that they come in safely. Selena is the next incredible person. Selena I met while she was cooking at a camp that we sponsor now who's feeding Moria several hundred meals a day because of the charity we founded. And Selena, we gave her a ride back to town, and she told us her story. She was like, you know, I just can't do anymore. Now I just cook. I'm like, what do you mean, Selena? She's like, well, it's just too much. I can't sleep. And I asked her, I slowly talked to her, and I got her to tell me her story. And Selena, over the summer, things were so bad. She started talking to this woman. It was like a heat wave in July. And she saw this woman with a tiny little newborn, and she crouched over and said, hey, what can I do? How can I help you? And the woman looks up and says, you know, I haven't washed my baby in 2 weeks, and it's hot. Can I wash my baby? And it was a newborn. And Selena's like, yes, come into my house, wash your baby. And after that, she found herself opening her home to, like, numerous mothers with their children, washing them and caring for them in her house. It got to the point where she couldn't rest because she knew that there was always somebody out there who needed the washing and stuff. And so this would just happen like all hours of the day. And it got to the point where it was completely unsustainable. And she's so sad and she's so regretful that she can't do that anymore. But she tells me now that all she can do is cook. And I'm saying, lady, you're doing so much more than anybody is doing. Timon here is this awesome guy, again, that I met my first trip. And have become really great friends with. Timon has a 4-year-old daughter. He has a wife. He has a 90-year-old father who is in the hospital. And yet every single Thursday, Timon went out and with this group to feed the homeless people in Athens. And when this refugee crisis happened, he's been working at all these different camps. Even with all his work and wife and children and family and all this stuff, he has made 3 trips to Edamini at the border in Macedonia to help feed people. And he's made 2 trips to Scala, where I was, and his wife has made trips. And they just toggle off to take care of their kids, and they go off on a 4-day weekend to go and help people in need. And this is why I want to tell their stories. So how you can help. I didn't save a lot of time for this, but there are lots of things that we can do. I did not set out, thinking that we were going to do anything more than me posting a whole bunch of stuff of what I saw happened. And what I ended up doing was, after seeing what I saw and that the big NGOs weren't doing anything, I came back and I started raising money. And now we have a charity called Sea of Solidarity, and every single dollar that we spend now goes, every single dollar that we get goes to, like, buying things like socks and sleeping bags and food and fruits. It wasn't even that hard for us to do, but we went and made it our business to do it. Awareness is a huge thing, because I really am afraid of the rhetoric that's happening in our country, of the xenophobia, of people talking about registering all Muslims and stuff like that. It really sounds a lot like, the Hitler and regime, where other people were forced to do that. And I really want us to end up, at the end of this, on the right side of history. And I really want that's actually why I'm here. I'm here because I want to see you people, but I'm also here because I think that it's all of our jobs to prevent that type of hatred and that type of talk from happening. And so when we see that happening, it's our job to explain who people are, why they're fleeing, and how we should have a much more open heart about that, because I don't think most people are aware, and I think it's all of our jobs to make sure that we do that. Think about technology. Already there are so many things that are bubbling up in Peter and my minds of what we can do to help with the situation. Peter's looking into a thermoscope to help with the boat rescue stuff. He's looking into an app where we can actually, visually tag boats that are coming in, so that all the rescuers can actually physically see the boats on an app before they do that. With this whole donation thing that I've been doing, I was just thinking, like, why don't we change how donations work? I really dislike the fact that, before all of this, Peter and I donated $1,000 between UNHCR and IRC, and we really felt cheated, after seeing what I saw about where the money is spent and stuff. And so I want more transparency in that whole donations thing. Right now, even with Sea of Solidarity, it's like, I don't want to be handling other people's money. I don't want to be making those types of transactions, but I do now because there's not a better platform. But you know what? Just like we have gift registries and shit like that, why don't we have, like, donation registries where all these little camps and people that I work with can say, I need 100 pairs of male shoes, and that we hook them up with little vendors in Greece so that we can just make that transaction happen. Then that way it empowers all those little guys to actually be able to get the kind of donations, and it empowers you, right, people who want to help, to actually know that your money is going directly into services. But these are the kinds of things that we can do. Yeah. Awesome. Yeah. Yeah, get us information on that, because we want to know that. And then the other piece is, okay, awesome, thank you. Sweet. And then other things, right? Volunteer. If you have a week off, 10 days, and you really want to, like, find out and learn for yourself what this thing is about, go and volunteer. And then also, if none of those things work out and you want to more passively, help, passive but good. I mean, so many of you, I look around here and I see friends. I also see donors, very, very generous donors. Donate to us. I can guarantee you that we don't use the money for anything other than directly helping the refugees. So that's all I have. Oh, I do want to leave you with one really cool picture of myself and to give a plug, because at the end of the day, I think people think of people who are doing this type of work. That's me. I was really cute. People think of people who help people and do all this work as like superheroes and stuff, and it really isn't. It's all of us. It's you, it's me, it's just us like taking a little bit more action. And I really want to take this opportunity to thank the Stutzmans. They are like the most middle class of middle class people that you can think of. They are grass farmers, not the cool grass, like regular hay grass farmers in Oregon. Hay farmers, yeah, I say grass farmers. People are like, oh. But they're hay farmers in the middle of Oregon, and they are Mennonites. And in the 70s, they were really much against the war that was happening in Vietnam, and they looked to themselves as a family and with their church about what they could do to help with the situation at that point. And even with their limited resources and whatnot, they decided to open up their hearts, and they brought a family, my family, a family of 3, to Oregon. They sponsored us. And what that meant was that they were solely responsible for getting us up to, up on our feet and getting us jobs and stuff like that and integrating us. And we lived with them for a few months. And this is like the first family that I really can remember. And I love this picture because look at how I snuggled up to Lou over there. Yeah, these people are my family, and that act that they did really cascaded into helping hundreds of other people that they had no idea about, because my dad then went on and sponsored people. And here I am today, 36 years later, paying it forward. So thank you.